So for our last session today, I'm delighted to say we have Claire McGettrick, who's one of the co-founders of the Clann project. She is going to be introduced by Patricia Carey, who's the newly appointed survivor advocate for the National Centre for Research and... It's not that you're not particularly connected to the centre, you're overall the survivor advocate. I met Patricia many years ago when she was working in the Adoption Authority, and she was interested then, a long time ago, in making records available to survivors so that they could find their birth information. So I'm going to ask Patricia to stand up and introduce Claire. Claire, best of luck.
Thanks very much, Katrina, and thank you to Katrina, Martha and the Royal Irish Academy for organising this conference today. I actually think we need to have this as an annual conference until the files are opened and there's full access for those who wish and require to see their records. And I also want to briefly just reflect on some of the thoughts of today, but particularly in relation to the Taoiseach's apology in 2021. And a line that always struck me was, each of you deserves so much better. And I think that that's something we should keep in our minds. And we still deserve so much better. We deserve for full access and open access to the files. And one of the words that was used quite commonly today was the word power. And the continual sealing of the files, particularly those that we still don't have access to of religious orders, is another exercise of power over people affected by forced family separation, people who are institutionalised, incarcerated in multiple institutions. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Claire McGettrick, born Lorraine Hughes. And Claire has just completed her Irish Research Council funded doctoral research in the School of Sociology in UCD. And her research, you won't be surprised to hear, focuses on adoption, so-called historical abuses and related injustices, of which there are many in 20th century Ireland. In 2023, she was awarded an honorary doctorate of laws by the NUI, and I think now we can call her Doctor. She has a long career. She was a co-founder of Justice for Magdalene's Research, Adoption Rights Alliance, also as a board member of the Irish Association of Social Workers. That's one that we need to debate. She also is on the Adoption Authority Research Subcommittee and has worked in the Clann project with Dr. Maeve O'Rourke, as well as working on the Magdalene Names project, which recorded over 1,900 women who lived, I use the word lived, respectfully, because they were incarcerated and many of them died in Magdalene Laundries. So one of Claire's most recent publications was Ireland and the Magdalene Laundries, a campaign for justice. So I know that we often say keep the best wine until last, but I think in this case it is truly the case. So welcome, Claire.
Thanks so much, Patricia, for that way too kind introduction. I just want to take this opportunity actually to congratulate Patricia on her appointment as special advisor, a special advocate for survivors. As I think most folks know, I've had reservations about how the minister has set up this particular role, and those concerns still stand. However, I've had the good fortune to have interacted with Patricia a lot over the last 10 years in her previous role as CEO of the Adoption Authority. And again, while I don't always agree with Adoption Authority policy, Patricia is approachable, and I would encourage people, affected people, survivors, adopted people, mothers, industrial school survivors, everybody affected, I would encourage people to engage with Patricia because she is approachable. She is, I know that trust has been broken over and over again. And I must say here, I am not speaking for everybody today. I'm speaking for myself, but I am an affected person, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I would encourage everybody, just give it a try. Sit and talk to Patricia. Her door, she's made very, very clear to me that her door is open. I'm not speaking for Patricia now when I say this, but I would just say, give her a chance. You know, I've reservations about the role, and I'm just conscious because there are affected people here today, and I just want to address that, you know, because there is an awful lot about us, without us, and stuff like that. But On that note, I want to, and I will not promise I'll get started in a second, Katrina. On that note, I want to commend Katrina for today, for making it inclusive, because there is an awful lot about us without us. And today, we've closed with somebody at least. I haven't experienced everything there is to experience, but I am one person, and I hope I can kind of do a little bit of justice to this. And thanks so much to everybody else who's been here today. I've listened with interest to everything that's happened before. So just by way of very quick background, the three perspectives I come to this work from. Firstly, I'm an adopted person. I was separated from my mother at birth. I grew up not knowing my own name, my mother's name, until I was 20. I'm 30 plus years in reunion. I bring that experience as well to the work I do. I'm also 30 plus years trying to access my own personal records. And while I've had some success, I still am denied access to my full adoption files. Very briefly, why the long name? When I was born, my mother named me Lorraine Hughes. And when I was adopted, I legally became Claire McGettrick. But because I legally became Claire McGettrick, I didn't stop being Lorraine Hughes. I am a Hughes. I walk like a Hughes. I talk like a Hughes. I am Lorraine Hughes. So therefore, I changed my name by deed poll to incorporate my full identity. Secondly, my personal experience, of course, led me to advocacy, and I'm so honoured to work with some wonderful people in Justice for Magdalen's Research, Adoption Rights Alliance and the Clann Project, and we've been just so privileged to have gathered testimony over the years from survivors, adopted people, other affected people. We're only experts at what we do because of because people have trusted us and people have talked to us, and you know, it's as I think Catherine calls it, we're gathering treasure. And finally, I've, for my troubles, entered the world of academia in the last decade or so. As Patricia said, I've just completed my doctoral research. And again, the reason I came knocking on the door of academia, I'm not looking for a career out of this, although I do need to pay a mortgage, but it's because there's been so much about us without us. And I'm not the only person. I see Philomena Mullins is here today, Conrad's here today. You know, there are people who have come knocking on the doors of academia, and I think that's to be welcomed, you know, because, you know, the more of us that insist on being equal participants, the better. And so speaking of which, quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. First of all, the why, the who, the what, and the how. Why preserve the testimony of affected people, of so-called historical injustices, whose testimonies should we preserve, what testimonies should be archived, and in what way should they be compiled, and how do we set about achieving this in the most ethical and inclusive way. My overall aim is to do that, is to convey the importance of ethically and inclusively preserving the testimonies of people most affected. I want to challenge popular conceptualizations of affected people, and including in that the insidious weaponization of language by the state and its agencies. I want to draw attention to the fact that the devil is in the detail, and we all have to know that, we all have to recognize that. And above all, I want everybody to stop and take a beat and reconsider what you think you know about all of us who are affected by these issues. And I hope I can give some insights from my perspective. So turning to why. So the government announcement, I won't read it all, but because Laura kindly covered it. But basically, one of the government aspects of the government announcement was that a unique aspect of the repository would be the inclusion of the personal testimonies of survivors. First of all, I want to sort of say that I'm going to be using the phrase affected people to cover everybody. I'll get to that under the who in a moment, but briefly, it's because I want to be as inclusive as possible. It's not a perfect phrase by any stretch of the imagination, but it's just to try and be as inclusive as I possibly can. So the inclusion of affected people's testimonies is very, very welcome. But I would argue that this should be standard practice. It shouldn't be seen as this unique, innovative thing. It should be simply standard practice. I mean, at the risk of stating the obvious, but sometimes in this area it feels like we always have to state the obvious, without affected people, without people who were incarcerated in mother and baby homes, Magdalene Laundries, industrial schools, without people who lost their identities through adoption, mothers who lost their children to adoption, there would be no official history to compile in the first place. So why on earth would you have anything about us without us? At first glance, again, the notion of allowing lived experiences to be formally accepted, it seems positive. But I'd also argue that there is a thinly veiled message there about who's considered an equal participant in the construction of knowledge and archives in this area. There's a gatekeeping of who has access, but there's also a gatekeeping of who's permitted to have representation and under what terms in the archival record. And it's beyond the scope of today, but we always have to, at every opportunity, emphasise the official record is deeply, deeply problematic. And it's used as the basis of a flawed redress scheme, and I worry that it's being used as the basis and the template for this national centre. So the experiences and the treatment of all of us who are affected by these issues, we are unfortunately excluded and ignored from mainstream histories. Notable exceptions, some of them in this room today, are those literary scholars, historians and others who have been writing in this area since the 1990s. But I would argue that the exclusion of affected people, it's not only discriminatory, it's unjust, it's unethical. And without us, you will only ever have a partial history. You will never get the full picture. You will not understand what happened, and history will keep repeating itself. I want to address how affected people are characterised. They're characterised as distressed, and considered as objects of knowledge to be studied instead of equal participants in this knowledge. And this gives rise to further management. They become targets of administration by the state. They become targets of management. And there's a focus on managing the emotions, managing how people react to things instead of focusing on giving us all equal rights to everything we deserve. And I would argue, yes, make counselling available, but while we're busy engaging in the management of emotions, the state gets off the hook. And that's the big problem. And while we fight amongst ourselves, the state gets off the hook. Many of us, as I've said, are resisting these characterizations. And through academia, many of us are coming knocking on the doors and saying, no, we need to be part of this. We are entitled to be knowers too. So to return to the question of why, well, affected people deserve nothing less than equal and active participation in the design and construction of knowledge and archives that concern them. Nothing without us. So, again, turning to who, the government announcement has said the National Centre will stand as a site of conscience to honour equally everybody who is resident in industrial schools, Magdalene Laundries, mother and baby homes, county homes, reformatories, and related institutions. So I just want to pause for a second and unpack that. What does that mean? Are we actually honouring everybody equally? So turning to institutions first, the state has traditionally taken a compartmentalised approach on focusing only ever on certain institutions. Whereas we in the Clann project are aware of at least 183 agencies, institutions and individuals who are involved with unmarried mothers and their children. So the key questions here are, what will be the scope of the related institutions in terms of records, in terms of which testimonies, and I'll come to that again in a moment, because we have what's known as a relevant record under the Birth Information and Trace Act, for example, but the devil is in the detail, because when you look at the schedule to that legislation, you notice that, well, actually what's defined as a relevant record, we don't actually mean all records when we say that. So that is a major concern. Just to unpack it further, the state's narrative is that injustices against women and children were solely institutional. But to use my colleague Jim Smith's phrase, Ireland's architecture of containment was both concrete and abstract. We're not just talking about institutions here. We're not just talking about buildings. Parents and children were separated from each other in myriad ways through mother and baby homes, adoption, industrial schools, laundries, you name it, and people were incarcerated only because there were legislative frameworks to do it, only because there were discourses, the way people were talked about and seen, only because there was an absence of choice and rights and people were seen differently. And, if we focus only on the institutions, we miss that, and guess what? History's already repeating itself by how we other people. So, we need to learn from what happened. Not all adopted people, by the way, were in mother and baby homes, and while we focus on institutions, the state again gets off the hook. And this represents an exacerbation of past injustices, but it's also another injustice in and of itself, because we're being excluded from the record, from access to our own records, and from redress. In terms of terminology, this is, and as I say, I'm using the phrase affected people today because I want to make sure that, I'm as inclusive as I can possibly be, but I think there was a kind of a change around the time that the Mother and Baby Homes Commission was established, because before that, adopted people were people who were adopted, boarded out people were people who were boarded out, mothers were women who lost children to adoption, and survivors were people who were incarcerated in in industrial schools and laundries. That's a generalisation, but it's just in general. But in what happened since the establishment of the Mother and Baby Homes Commission is first of all, there was such a restrictive terms of reference for the Commission. It sort of reinforced this narrative that abuses were solely institutional. And it also sort of marked the beginning of this kind of application of the language of institutional abuse to the issue of forced family separation. So now you've got survivors used as a kind of an umbrella term. And as I'll get to, I think it's in the next slide, we're not a homogenous group. That's not how everybody, identifies. And this further reinforces this institutional narrative. It leaves forced family separation off the hook, and it's further exacerbation of past injustices. So affected people were not a homogenous group. Experiences vary, even within cohorts. There are many ways to be an adopted person, a survivor, how we identify, whether you call yourself a survivor, an affected person, an adopted person, a mother, that varies with every experience. And, you should, no matter what way you identify, it shouldn't be used to minimise the human rights abuses that were perpetrated against you. You have the right, to have what happened to you acknowledged, regardless of how you identify. I personally don't identify as a survivor, but I know other adopted people who do, and that's fine. And I respect everybody's right to identify as they see fit. And I would also challenge the idea of how the state categorises us. And again, I think, as all of us who are affected, in this big umbrella group of people who are affected by these issues, we need to resist the idea of how the state is categorising us and just let each person identify as they see fit, And because again, if we're arguing about the words that we use, the state is getting off the hook, I would argue. So finally on the who, I want to ask, who is the National Centre for? Is it going to be a site of conscience for some, or is it going to be a site of conscience for all? Because if it's a site of conscience for some, then it defeats the purpose. And we're not going away, by the way. And, one of my main messages is leave nobody behind. You can't leave people behind. So, nearly there. In terms of the what, so whose testimonies? Well, I've covered that in the previous slides, okay? Who's considered a person that can deposit their testimony in the National Centre? Who can do it? Is it the Mother and Baby Homes Commission testimonies? Well, as we know, as we've heard, these were curated, they were skewed, they were inaccurately recorded, and they were unethically gathered, I would argue. What about the testimonies that were ignored by the Commission? And will everybody be given an opportunity to opt in or out? Will people who gave testimonies via the Clann project, will they be allowed to submit their testimonies to the National Centre? And what about independently compiled testimonies? And I'd argue that people should be facilitated to deposit their testimonies, if they wish, in the way they're most comfortable with. And I'm going to cover the ethics of it all in a moment. But in terms of the what, if you want to compile a witness statement, you can't do it without access to all records. You simply can't. Okay, you can talk about what happened to you, but you cannot compile a comprehensive full witness statement on what happened to you. Okay, so the Birth Information and Tracing Act, there are some positive outcomes, but people are excluded, as Maeve pointed out, mothers. Records are excluded, plus it's a discriminatory bill. Under the law at the moment, it's beyond the scope of this, but I just, again, to put it on the record, under the law at the moment, Irish adopted people are treated as if they don't understand privacy. And that's as simple as that. And so that is not a measure of redress. That is an additional injustice in my book. So an affected person, again, as I say, they can't testify to the full extent of what happened to them in the absence of all records. And by records, I mean personal records, administrative records, state records, and private records in the hands of adoption brokers and others. And to use, I'll only speak for myself here, my usual line is, I don't know why I'm Claire McGettrick and not Katrina Palmer. Katrina and I were both in Temple Hill within 12 months of each other. I could have easily grown up as Katrina Palmer. She could have easily grown up as Claire McGettrick. That's the arbitrariness of adoption. We don't know from the records. I've received quite a few records under the new legislation, but I still can't tell you how that came to be. Who made that decision? Was it a flick of a pen? Was it a committee decision? And I think that's pretty significant. I think we deserve to know that information. So, on to the how. Last two slides. The how concerns the ethics of all of this. And I know that one of the main concerns here for a lot of affected people is privacy and making sure that nobody's private lives are going to be exposed, within this centre. So the first, number one key priority is do no harm. First, do no harm. Affected people have to be at the centre of this process. And that can't just be lip service, it has to be actually meaningfully at the centre of this process. What kinds of harm, So the deposit of testimony, it has to be voluntary on the one hand, emphasis on voluntary, and you have to, even if it means repeating yourself over and over again, people need to hear that they will not be forced to hand over their testimonies, and if it has to be said 100 times, let's say it 100 times. On the other sort of end of that scale, it shouldn't also be exclusionary. If people want to have their testimonies included, they shouldn't be turned away. They should be included if they want to. Privacy above all else, but not secrecy. There's a big difference between the two. And comprehensive consultation on redactions. Informed consent, and by that I mean, making very, very clear the uses and the possible uses of the testimony and their wishes respected. Some people might want to wait until after they're deceased, for example, to deposit a testimony. That should be facilitated. Affected people should be prioritised in the hierarchy of access above all else. Because it was fascinating to hear some of the presentations from earlier in the day where, the different approaches to different kinds of records, how for in certain archives, things are just flown wide open, and but when adoption or Magdalene Laundries or industrial schools or mother and baby homes come into it, suddenly the shutters come down and everybody gets scared of us. Meaningful consultation, and by meaningful I mean meaningful. Again, not curated, not lip service, not management. It's very, very positive that Patricia is on the, in her role as special advocate, is on the steering committee. But the birth information and tracing bill, to use that as an example, was the steering group for that went on without a single affected person in that respect being on the committee. And I'm not talking about just consultation. I'm talking about a meaningful seat at the seat of power. We shouldn't be managed and curated, and as I say, it's a hugely positive move that Patricia is on the steering committee. But more of this, please. More of it. Not it's very civil servant heavy, is what I would say. And I do appreciate that Laura has come today, by the way. It's welcome that Laura came today to give the presentation, even if I am saying difficult things. Last slide. Again, in terms of priorities, no closing date for the deposit of testimonies. People are ready when they are ready. And I can't emphasise that enough. People have windows in time when they feel they can deal with these issues, and no closing date, just whenever you want to. You should have the right to clarify, amend or add to your testimony. What do I mean by that? Well, there's a lot of talk about these being historic abuses, but guess what? They continue in the present, and your experience is, I'm adopted 24/7, guys. It's not a 9-to-5 job, It changes all the time. So, so you should be able to add to that, to clarify it, moreover, after you obtain records, you gain a new sort of an insight into, what happened to you, and that changes your perspective. It just, in many, many ways, each person is different, okay? You should have the right to withdraw your testimony if you change your mind. And essential in part of that process is, to make it very clear from the outset how it might be used. So even if it has been used, if a person wants it out, they should just be allowed to take it out. I've concerns in this regard because, I will, and again, I'll speak from my own experience here. I submitted my own personal testimony to the Commission of Investigation. It was ignored because I wasn't on the terms of reference. And I want my testimony removed from the archive held by the department. I don't want it there under these circumstances, because my testimony was disrespected. And no offence to Laura, as I say, I'm glad she's here today, but I frankly don't trust the state. I do not trust the department, and I don't want my testimony there under those circumstances. I have repeatedly tried to get it back under GDPR legislation, and I have been repeatedly refused, okay? So if the state wants us to trust, the state is going to have to do a hell of a lot better job than it has been doing so far, okay? The trust, as I say, the trust in the state, it's non-existent. It's, and I'm hearing concerns expressed today. I'm hearing people's concerns, and I understand, the official record calls us liars, there is a divide and conquer thing going on, and I would just urge people not to buy into it. Thousands are excluded from the action plan. So further harms are actually already happening, but we need to try and prevent them, and we need to leave nobody behind. For further information, our 3 websites are there. Feel free to take a screenshot or whatever, but thanks so much. I've probably gone way over time.